the question of freedom is rather central to the question of ethical action. The reason is that we have to ask ourselves the question, is freedom a condition for moral action or its end, its purpose, its result? Leading on from that question is the need to distinguish between freedom, license, and also to explore liberalism. And that's what we'll be doing in this presentation. One thing we can conclude fairly easily is that beings that do not have freedom cannot make moral choices. We don't think of oak trees or slugs as being guilty of virtue or vice. If a lion eats a man, we don't consider that they've committed murder. They are simply doing what lions do. And the same with sharks and snakes biting people and that sort of thing. Because they don't have free will. Likewise, for humans, if you are forced to do some good act, maybe because someone has got a gun sticking in your back, you may have a result which is a good moral action, in other words, an act that achieves the good. But you don't necessarily have anything which is a reflection of your moral fibre, your moral character. You haven't actually acted ethically. You haven't made an ethical decision. So we've got to make some decisions here. Moral action is simply that objective act that achieves some good. And good is a word that we use to describe something, evaluate something in terms of its ability to lead to happiness. A good wine is one which tastes very nice. A good car is one that travels very quickly and perhaps corners and is comfortable to sit in. They're all things that, in our use of them, lead to us to some pleasure, some happiness, lead us towards greater happiness. We have to distinguish between pleasure and happiness. Way back in time, Plato suggested that happiness came from presenting a human faculty with its proper object. And so my sense of taste, which is one of my human faculties, is delighted by the taste of a good wine. And so a pleasant tasting wine leads to my happiness because by drinking it, I'm presenting that faculty of taste with its proper object. I could present my faculty of taste with something else, some weird artificial flavour or something. It might lead to a certain delight, but it wouldn't eventually lead to my happiness because it might be poisonous or something. This question of moral action, though, is objective. In a sense, I could make a motor car that achieves the good because it does what good motor cars do. It's pleasant to drive. That's distinct, though, from moral choices. And that's where humans distinguish themselves from animals. And again, when we're talking about lions and tigers eating people, it's quite different to people eating people. A moral choice is something which can only be done by a free person who has the faculty of goodwill. A free lion or tiger is a very dangerous thing, but they're not an immoral lion or tiger. A free person is able to choose to practice cannibalism, or they can choose not to. And to the extent that we're able to avoid eating each other, to that extent we would be considered to be good people. We are making good moral choices. Now, freedom, one way or another, only is available through freedom. Humans have special capacities that animals don't. Humans, as Homo sapiens, have intellect and will. We have the ability to understand things at a depth that animals can't, so we can understand concepts and relationships and implications. When a dog is faced with some tasty piece of food in front of it, all the dog can think about is eating. especially if they're hungry. Humans might be hungry. They might be faced with something which is quite delightful to the taste, but they may have decided to go on a diet, or they may have decided that that particular taste will cause them some ill, rot their teeth, or cause them to become diabetic or something. And so even though you're faced with the same sensory stimulus, a human can will something which is counter to their inclinations, to their passions, their emotional feeling to want to have the pleasant experience. Willing, in other words, making a free will decision, is something that can only be done with human freedom. This leaves us needing to look at what freedom means. There are two definitions of freedom that tend to almost, I won't say contradict each other, but compete for the title of being deserving as our understanding of freedom. The first is a rather simple definition of freedom. That is, freedom is absence of restraint. So in other words, if I do have someone with a gun behind my back forcing me to walk the little old lady across the road, I'm not actually acting, I'm not actually making a moral choice. I'm not doing anything which is good or bad by taking her across the road. I'm simply doing what I'm forced to do. And so if that restraint is absent, that's certainly freedom, and it's one form of freedom. There's a second form of freedom, second definition of freedom, which is freedom as the freedom to flourish, to be the best one can be, the most perfect. We can understand this second freedom as voluntary self-restraint. And when we look around us, we find that those people that we have great respect for and appear to have the most fulfilled lives tend to be those who practice the greatest self-restraint. Looking at our athletes is probably the best example. You don't get to be a highly sought-after professional footballer by sitting in front of the television eating your favourite food all the time. To be a sportsman, you must subject yourself to the self-discipline of a regime of diet and exercise and sleep and everything else. But it's only by subjecting yourself to that strict restraint that you're able to have the freedom to become great. And so it's almost a paradox built into the notion of freedom. Ultimately, there is that inner decision that the person makes when they decide to make themselves a great athlete. And so while there's a mental choice that's made, overall, the results come in terms of self-restraint. And it's similar in other areas of our lives. Moral self-restraint also helps us to realise the common good. And again, that's quite distinct from the idea of simply an absence of restraint. If I walk down the street and find myself encountering somebody who is practicing their freedom as absence of restraint, and perhaps has a machine gun, I might find that my capacity for experiencing human happiness has sort of gone down a few pegs. Not very pleasant. However, if I go down the same street and come across an athlete practicing or what have you, I might find the experience rather delightful to watch. One way or another, this kind of notion of freedom makes civilization rather delightful to be a part of. It does mean that we have to contribute to it in some active way and a free way. Let's look at true freedom in society. The freedom is freedom to flourish, to be the best one can be, the most perfect, is certainly the most attractive form of freedom, and it's the most civilizing. And it's largely got to do with what people expect of professionals. They expect professionals to be people that go out of their way for their own motivation to do the best they can, whether it's a doctor, a lawyer, or a property valuer. And that's one of the reasons why the community expects property valuers to be able to answer a lot more questions about property than merely what's my property worth, and really to be having a passion for property, if you like. We can now move to what I would describe as two more freedoms. We've seen freedom from restraint as the starting point. We've seen freedom to be as the ideal for a civilized society. We can now look at the notion of freedom as liberty, and we'll find a rather strange thing. A couple of hundred years ago, two notions of liberty as being the ideal for society became very popular in Western thinking. Oddly enough, these two approaches to liberty are almost diametrically opposed. If we are living in the United States and someone is described as liberal, and liberal has to do with liberty, you'd be describing somebody who would be considered to be on the left of politics. That'd be somebody who is of the belief that you need strong government in order to stop people from exploiting each other. That's the left-wing idea of solving our political problems. And so it's largely a political movement associated with things like socialism and ultimately with communism. The curious thing about it is that while the American liberal is all about strong government, the very fact that you need strong government means that you're talking about some coercive force, some great force in the community. If people need to be forced into behaving properly, so people aren't exploiting each other in the way that the socialists are very fond of blaming the capitalists and so on, what it really means is that the left-wing liberal, the American or continental liberal, is in fact not believing in liberty at all, at least not liberty for society, because it wants all of society to come under the coercive force of a strong government. And so the left-wing liberal is curiously not really liberal at all. That form of liberty is understood in America. It's also the notion of a liberal that you will find on continental Europe. However, if you go to that little island just off Europe called Britain, you'll find that there is a completely different understanding of what it is to be a liberal. In Australia, we get the British notion of liberalism from our major conservative political party. The liberal on the right side of politics believes that the community needs freedom from those, well, dole bludgers and whatever else that one way or another are social parasites. And they might also believe that you need freedom from monopolies and so on. And generally, the solution is that we need a strong market. Get rid of government because they're dreadful folks, and have a strong market instead. And that's largely the political position of the liberals on the right. As I say, the Liberal Party in Australia, the British liberals, the liberal capitalists, to use that term as you find it in the United States. Again, all promoting the idea of liberty, being liberal. When we look a little bit deeper, we find that the right-wing liberal, the British liberal, is rather curious again because they're advocating using market forces to solve many of our political and economic problems. Let's look a little bit closer here. We're talking about market forces will fix our economic problems. What's that to do with markets? We're using market force, not any kind of ethical decision on the part of the market actor, but rather some impersonal, overpowering force in the market which causes people to charge the right price when they go into the market, even though they'd prefer to go otherwise. And so we use market forces to stop people from acting like monopolists or stop people from forming labour monopolies through trade unions and that sort of stuff. What's happening here? Again, we have this paradox. We're using force, strong market forces, in order to cause freedom. How can you have coerced people being free in a way which gives you moral merit, ethical decisions? The answer is that the right-wing liberal doesn't believe in real freedom or real liberty any more than the left-wing liberal. One wants strong government, the other one wants a strong market, and whether you have a market force or government force, it all means that we're organising society on the basis of force, which seems to be a strange paradox because we have such strong and polarised views that one form of liberty, which is using one form of force, is going to somehow solve our problems and give us the moral objective of freedom, in other words, freedom of restraint. I'll leave you to contemplate that in your own time. We can now make some conclusions about the relationship between freedom and ethics. The first thing that we have noticed is that freedom is necessary for moral action. Freedom from restraint is only a part of the freedom that completes the human person, and it's certainly necessary for moral action. However, it is not an end. Freedom from restraint is not the moral objective of society. Freedom to be is the highest freedom, the highest form of freedom, because it enables human excellence. It gives the athlete the opportunity, the freedom, the scope to be able to excel. And it does the same for the professional. Although in one area it's physical excellence, in the other it's professional and ethical excellence. Freedom is not a moral end in itself. And most importantly, when we look at liberalism, that application of freedom from restraint, we find that in practice, liberalism, both in its left and right forms, both rely on preventing free moral action by expecting the use or mandating, promoting the use of force against individuals in society. And we started our discussion on freedom by suggesting that the degree to which one is constrained, is forced by external forces, to that degree you don't have the capacity for genuine moral action, even though under those constrained conditions you might achieve some moral good. It's not really befitting of a human community. Somehow something else is necessary for civilization. And this is where we have to come back from freedom as an end, back to the question of ethics and how do they work, where do they come from, and why is it they're so necessary for civilization and society itself.